The USS Defiant is one of the most beloved starships in Star Trek history. Small, powerful, and heavily armed, it became a symbol of Starfleet at war. During the Dominion War, it earned a reputation as one of the toughest vessels in the Federation fleet, standing toe-to-toe with Jem'Hadar attack ships, Cardassian warships, and Klingon battlecruisers. But that's not why the Defiant was built. The Defiant had a far more specific mission. A mission born from one of Starfleet's greatest encounters, the Borg. Following the catastrophic Battle of Wolf 359, Starfleet set out to create a vessel capable of defeating the cybernetic menace that had nearly conquered the Federation. This was a dedicated Borg killer. The Defiant was envisioned as a starship built for one purpose. Yet when the Borg finally returned to Earth in 2373, the Defiant was left crippled, drifting through space and moments away from destruction. So what happened? Did Starfleet's ultimate anti-Borg weapon actually fail this mission? Today, we're investigating one of the most fascinating questions in Star Trek history. Did the Defiant fail the very reason it was created? If you enjoy these Star Trek videos, hit that subscribe button to never miss another one. Okay, let's go. A quick message before we talk about the Defiant. If you love lore deep dive videos, like this one, then consider checking out our Star Wars focused YouTube channel. A channel link is in the video's description. Yes, we know Star Trek vs Star Wars, but it's all good fun. Check it out. Anyway, back to Trek. The USS Defiant is one of those rare Starfleet ships that almost every fan loves. It looks aggressive, it packs an absurd amount of firepower into a relatively small frame, and it played a major role throughout Deep Space Nine. But despite its popularity, there's one aspect of the Defiant's history that often gets overlooked. The ship wasn't originally designed to fight the Dominion. It wasn't designed to battle the Klingons or the Breen, and it certainly wasn't created to defend Deep Space Nine. The Defiant project began with one enemy in mind: the Borg Collective. As mentioned, today we're taking a closer look at Starfleet's anti-Borg warship, its performance against the very threat it was designed to stop, and whether the Defiant ultimately succeeded or failed in its original mission. Okay, to understand the Defiant, we first need to understand Wolf 359. For much of the 24th century, Starfleet enjoyed an unprecedented era of peace and exploration. While conflict still occurred, the Federation's primary focus did remain on diplomacy, scientific advancement, and ultimately, exploration. Most Starfleet starships reflected those priorities. Ships like the Galaxy class were designed as explorers first, and then warships as a second priority. Then the Borg arrived. They were first encountered by the USS Enterprise D in 2365. Now the Borg represented a threat unlike anything Starfleet had ever faced. They possessed superior technology, incredible resilience, and the terrifying ability to adapt to almost any tactical response. Years later, the Borg would return. The Battle of Wolf 359 became one of the darkest days in Federation history. A fleet of 40 Starfleet vessels intercepted a single Borg cube near the Wolf 359 system. The outcome was devastating. 39 starships were destroyed, over 11,000 Starfleet personnel were either killed or assimilated. Entire starships and their crews were wiped out in a matter of minutes. And perhaps most alarming of it all, the Borg achieved all of this with a single cube vessel. The battle exposed a harsh truth. Starfleet wasn't prepared for proper combat. Its existing fleet had been designed for exploration, diplomacy, and scientific research. Also, a lot of the ships were of older designs, and therefore somewhat outdated. The Borg didn't care about any of that. Looking at the Battle of Wolf 359, the Borg didn't just destroy starships. It destroyed Starfleet's confidence. As such, the Federation needed a new answer, and the answer would become the Defiant Project. In the aftermath of Wolf 359, Starfleet faced a question that would fundamentally change how it approached starship design. How do you fight an enemy like the Borg? An enemy that adapts to whatever you throw at them. For generations, Starfleet's answer to almost every challenge had been flexibility. Need a science vessel? You can send a Galaxy class. Need some diplomacy? Send a Galaxy class. Need exploration? Send the Galaxy class. Need combat? Well, also send the Galaxy class. Now that plan sorta worked for a while, until the destruction of the USS Odyssey proved that even the Galaxy class was not invincible. The Federation's design philosophy centered on multi-purpose starships capable of performing a wide range of missions. The Excelsior class design was a prime example of this. Wolf 359 proved that approach did have its limits. The Borg did not care how many diplomatic receptions your starship could host. They didn't care how advanced your sensor suite actually was, and they also didn't care how many families actually lived aboard a starship. The only thing that really mattered was combat effectiveness. For perhaps the first time in modern Federation history, Starfleet began considering something it traditionally avoided: a dedicated warship. Not an explorer, not a science vessel, not a cruiser designed to be a little bit of everything. This was a starship designed specifically to fight. The result became known as the Defiant Project. One of the key figures involved in the Defiant Project was a Starfleet officer who understood the Borg threat better than most: Commander Benjamin Sisko. At the Battle of Wolf 359, Sisko served aboard the Miranda-class USS Saratoga. He witnessed the destruction firsthand. He lost friends and colleagues, but most tragically, he lost his wife Jennifer during the battle. The scars left by Wolf 359 would remain with him for years. But when Starfleet began developing a vessel specifically designed to counter the Borg threat, Sisko became heavily involved in the project. His experiences helped shape many of the ideas behind the Defiant's design. This wasn't just another engineering exercise. For many involved, including Sisko, it was personal. The Federation could never afford another Wolf 359. Something had to be done. What made the Defiant truly unique was how dramatically it departed from traditional Starfleet thinking. Look at almost any Federation ship before the Defiant, and you'll notice familiar styles. These could include luxury interiors, large crews, and scientific laboratories, but also diplomatic facilities, family accommodations, holodecks, and many more fantastic things. The Defiant abandoned most of that. The ship measured only around 170 meters in length, 134 meters wide, and 30 meters in height. Its crew complement was tiny compared to vessels like the Galaxy-class USS Enterprise D. But also, there were no schools, no civilian families, no luxurious diplomatic suites. Typically, a Defiant class would carry around 40 crew members. Every cubic meter of internal volume was dedicated to one purpose: combat effectiveness. The Defiant wasn't designed to represent the Federation, it was designed to defend it. Perhaps the most famous description of a Defiant class vessel is overgunned and overpowered for a ship of its size. Now that single line perfectly sums up the Defiant. Everything about the vessel pushed Starfleet's engineering to its limits. For example, the ship mounted 4 pulse phaser cannons. It was a weapon system rarely seen on other Federation vessels. Unlike traditional phaser arrays, these cannons delivered concentrated bursts of energy capable of inflicting tremendous damage. For a ship of its size, the Defiant possessed truly remarkable offensive firepower. It also carried photon torpedoes and later quantum torpedoes, giving it another powerful weapon against heavily armoured targets. Taken together, the Defiant's arsenal rivaled that of vessels significantly larger than itself. Starfleet wasn't interested in creating a balanced ship design, it wanted a pure weapon. Firepower alone wouldn't be enough against the Borg. Wolf 359 had demonstrated that clearly. Starfleet vessels had landed hits against the cube. The problem was surviving long enough to keep fighting. Therefore, the Defiant received some of the most advanced defensive systems available to engineers. Its compact frame represented a smaller target than traditional cruisers. The ship incorporated ablative armor technology to increase survivability. Its shields were exceptionally powerful for a vessel of that size, and its structural framework was designed to withstand punishment that would cripple many larger starships. The philosophy was simple: the Defiant needed to stay in the fight. If the Borg adapted to one weapon, the ship could switch tactics. If shields failed, armor could buy time. If the battle turned desperate, the Defiant could keep firing long after other ships had been destroyed. On paper, it looked exactly like the answer Starfleet needed. Now there was just one problem: the Defiant was too powerful. Starfleet engineers had packed so much firepower, shielding, and propulsion technology into such a compact hull that the ship began to develop serious operational issues. The engines were incredibly powerful. Some might say excessively powerful. During testing, engineers discovered the ship was experiencing stability issues. The immense stress generated by the vessel's systems placed enormous strain on the space frame. In simple terms, the Defiant was almost tearing itself apart. The project quickly developed a reputation for being difficult and troublesome. For a time, Starfleet seriously considered shelving the entire program. The Borg threat appeared to have diminished following the events of the Wolf 359 encounter, and many Starfleet officials questioned whether the Federation still needed such a specialized vessel. As a result, the Defiant project was effectively put on hold. The prototype remained unfinished, and for a brief moment, Starfleet's Borg killer looked destined to become a forgotten experiment. Fortunately for Starfleet, events in the Bajor sector and the Gamma Quadrant would give the Defiant a second chance. When Deep Space Nine discovered the Bajoran wormhole and began attracting increased strategic importance, Starfleet needed a vessel capable of defending the station against emerging threats. Now, Deep Space Nine had done well in the first year or two, but with the mysterious Dominion making itself known, and the loss of the Galaxy-class USS Odyssey, things changed. Commander Sisko personally requested the Defiant. The unfinished prototype was retrieved from storage and assigned to Deep Space Nine. Chief Miles O'Brien and the station's engineering teams spent considerable time correcting many of the vessel's early issues. The Starship was never perfect. Even throughout its operational life, crews occasionally complained about maintenance difficulties and operational quirks, but it was finally ready. The ship was ready to prove itself, and most importantly, it was eventually ready to face the Borg. And that opportunity would come sooner than anyone expected. For many years, Starfleet had prepared for this exact moment. The lessons of Wolf 359 had been studied, new tactical situations had been developed, entire Starship projects had been launched. And at the center of those preparations stood the USS Defiant. Everything the ship represented could be traced back to one question: what happens when the Borg come back? In 2373, years after the Battle of Wolf 359, Starfleet finally got this answer. A Borg cube entered Federation space and began advancing directly towards Earth. Immediately, memories of Wolf 359 came flooding back. The Federation had seen this nightmare before: a single cube, a direct course for Earth. There was a very real possibility that billions of lives were at stake. This time, however, Starfleet intended to be ready. A large defensive fleet was assembled to intercept the Borg vessel before it could reach the Sol system. Among the ships responding to the crisis was the USS Defiant. At last, the anti-Borg warship was about to face the enemy it had been built to destroy. This was the Defiant's reason for existing. If there was ever a moment for the ship to prove itself, this was it. By the time the Sovereign-class USS Enterprise E arrived on the scene, the battle was already underway, and Federation forces had suffered heavy damage. Dozens of Starfleet vessels were engaged with a Borg cube en route to Earth. Before the Enterprise got there, dozens of Starfleet vessels were engaged with a Borg cube while it was en route to Earth. The fighting was intense. Starships were being damaged and destroyed as they attempted to stop the Borg advance. By the time the Enterprise arrived at the Sol system and Sector 001, the Defiant had taken serious damage, with multiple crew members dead and systems offline. Mr. Worf, who was the commanding officer of the tough little ship, prepared one final effort after losing the ship's weapons. Worf was preparing to ram the Defiant into the Borg cube. Thankfully, the Enterprise's arrival cut short the last-ditch plan. Captain Picard was informed the Defiant was losing life support and ordered her crew to be beamed aboard the Enterprise. Even though the ship was crippled by the time of the Enterprise's arrival, and despite the overwhelming odds, the Defiant was still in the fight. The ship was taking punishments that would have destroyed many larger vessels. Its shields were collapsing and systems were failing. Damage was spreading throughout the ship, yet it continued attacking. If there was ever a demonstration of the Defiant's resilience, this was it. The starships and explorers around it were falling back or had been long destroyed. The Defiant kept firing. Commanding the Defiant during the battle was Lieutenant Commander Worf. Having previously served aboard the Enterprise D, Worf now found himself leading Starfleet's most specialized combat vessel against its greatest enemy. And things were not going well. As the battle continued, the Defiant suffered catastrophic damage. Multiple systems failed, weapons even went offline, and life support began shutting down. The ship was effectively being torn apart. Eventually, the situation became so dire that Worf issued an order no captain ever wants to give. Prepare to abandon ship. But he didn't actually say that. Think about it for a moment though. Worf did say ramming speed, not abandon ship. Of course, the vessel specifically designed to fight the Borg had been reduced to a drifting wreck. Its crew were preparing one last maneuver. Its mission was effectively over. The Defiant was no longer capable of continuing the fight, so sacrificing the ship might have been the only option. For a ship built to defeat the Borg, this was a devastating outcome, and it does raise an uncomfortable question. If the Defiant couldn't survive its first major engagement with the Borg, had the project already failed? As mentioned, before the Defiant could sacrifice itself, the Enterprise E entered the battle. The Sovereign-class starship immediately engaged the cube, drawing its attention away from the crippled Defiant. Moments later, the Enterprise rescued the surviving crew and continued the attack. This is where the story becomes particularly interesting. Because when most fans remember the Battle of Sector 001, they remember the destruction of the Borg cube. The Federation wins, Earth is saved, and the Borg are defeated. Mission accomplished. But who actually achieved that victory? It wasn't the Defiant. The ship contributed to the battle, the crew fought bravely, and the vessel absorbed enormous amounts of punishment. Yet by the final stages of the engagement, the Defiant was effectively out of action. The killing blow came from the Enterprise E, with the combined firepower of the remaining Federation fleet. Picard identified a weakness in the cube. The Enterprise and the remaining Starfleet vessels concentrated their firepower. The cube was destroyed, the Defiant survived, but it did not defeat the Borg. Of course, we do know what happens next. I should also state the Battle of Sector 001 and this engagement with the Borg cube is actually a lot more drawn out than people see in the movie of First Contact. We've actually done a full breakdown on every starship, including the Defiant, at the Battle of Sector 001 and the Battle of Wolf 359. I'll link those videos down below, as it's a great idea to understand the differences between Starfleet starships. Now, before we go any further, it is important to be fair to the Defiant. The ship was never fighting alone. Of course, it wasn't expected to destroy a Borg cube single-handedly. And unlike the vessels at Wolf 359, it did actually survive the encounter. That's an achievement in itself. The Defiant undoubtedly performed better against the Borg than most previous Federation starships. Its weapons proved effective, its armour held longer than many expected, the compact design made it surprisingly difficult to outright destroy. And in many respects, the ship validated much of Starfleet's thinking. But that's not the same thing as completing its mission. Remember how the project was originally conceived. The Defiant wasn't built merely to survive the Borg, it wasn't built to delay them, it was built to stop them. And at Sector 001 and the ensuing battle, it failed to do so. The Borg did reach Earth, and the Defiant was crippled. The Enterprise E and the remaining starships ultimately delivered the decisive victory. For critics of the Defiant project, that alone is a compelling argument. Starfleet invested years of development, enormous resources, and a complete departure from its traditional design philosophy. But when the moment of truth arrived, the Borg killer needed saving from the Borg. Of course, there is another way to view the battle. Perhaps the real failure wasn't the Defiant itself. Perhaps the real failure was the expectation placed upon it. Wolf 359 had traumatized Starfleet. The Federation desperately wanted a solution. A weapon, a ship, something that could guarantee victory the next time the Borg returned. But maybe that expectation was never realistic. The Borg weren't a threat that could be solved by a single starship design, not even one specifically built to fight them. The Defiant had proved it could stand against the Borg cube. It had survived an engagement that destroyed dozens of ships at Wolf 359. It had brought valuable time for the rest of the fleet. And perhaps most importantly, it had shown that Starfleet was learning and adapting, just as the Borg were. The question now wasn't whether the Defiant could fight the Borg, it clearly could. The question was whether Starfleet had asked too much of that one ship design. The years that followed would prove the Defiant's greatest victories still lay ahead of it. Ironically, they wouldn't come against the Borg at all. If the ship's story ended at Sector 001, the Defiant's legacy would be very different. The ship built to stop the Borg had fought bravely, survived against overwhelming odds, but ultimately failed to deliver the decisive victory Starfleet had hoped for. Fortunately for the Defiant, history wasn't finished with it yet. Because while Starfleet remained concerned about the Borg, another threat was rapidly emerging on the far side of the galaxy, the Dominion. Unlike the Borg, the Dominion wasn't a single enemy, it was an empire. This vast interstellar power, located in the Gamma Quadrant, ruled by the Changelings, known as the Founders, and enforced with the military might of the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta, were unstoppable. At first, the Dominion appeared to be little more than a regional power beyond the Bajoran wormhole in the Gamma Quadrant. But that illusion didn't last long. As tensions escalated throughout the 2370s, it became increasingly clear that war was coming. And when it finally arrived, the Defiant found itself perfectly suited for the conflict. Not because it had been designed for the Dominion, but because the Dominion War demanded exactly the kind of ship the Defiant happened to be. By the time the Dominion War officially erupted, the USS Defiant had become a familiar sight around Deep Space Nine. Of course, the space station sat at one of the most strategically important locations in the entire galaxy, the entrance to the Bajoran wormhole. Whoever controlled the wormhole could potentially control access between the Alpha and Gamma quadrants. That made Deep Space Nine a prime target, and it meant Starfleet needed a vessel capable of responding quickly to threats. The Defiant excelled in that role. Unlike larger ships that often required significant support and logistics, the Defiant could deploy rapidly and engage hostile forces almost immediately. Its speed, firepower, and durability made it ideal for defending the space station. Before long, the ship became synonymous with Deep Space Nine itself. Just as the Enterprise represented exploration, the Defiant came to represent Starfleet's wartime efforts. One of the greatest strengths of the Defiant was its ability to engage Jem'Hadar attack ships. These vessels were fast, heavily armed, and extremely dangerous, and many traditional Starfleet designs struggled up against them. But the Defiant didn't. Its pulse phaser cannons proved particularly effective against Jem'Hadar vessels, allowing the ship to deliver devastating bursts of firepower during close-range engagements. Combined with quantum torpedoes and advanced defensive systems, the Defiant could hold its own against opponents specifically designed for combat. Time and time again, the ship found itself fighting enemies that outnumbered it, and time again, it survived. This was exactly the type of warfare the Defiant had been built for. Not necessarily fighting the Borg, but fighting powerful enemy warships in direct combat. Perhaps nowhere was more evident of this than during Operation Return. Following the Dominion's capture of Deep Space Nine, Starfleet and its allies launched a massive offensive to retake the space station. The battle that followed became one of the largest fleet engagements in Federation history. Hundreds of starships participated, and right at the centre of the action was the USS Defiant. Commanded by Captain Benjamin Sisko, the ship led the Federation task force directly into the battle. The odds were daunting. Dominion and Cardassian forces heavily outnumbered the attacking fleet. Casualties mounted rapidly, entire formations were destroyed, and Miranda-class starships were getting blown up left, right, and centre. Yet the Defiant kept moving forward. Throughout the engagement, the ship repeatedly found itself in the thickest fighting. Thankfully, the Klingons did turn up to aid the battle, and by the battle's conclusion, Deep Space Nine had been liberated, and the Defiant had once again proven its worth. Now, what is fascinating is how different this success was from Starfleet's original expectations. The Defiant had been designed around a very specific threat, this being the Borg, yet its greatest victories came against entirely different enemies: Jem'Hadar attack ships, Cardassian warships, Dominion battlegroups, and Klingon vessels during periods of political tension. The Defiant excelled not because it was a perfect anti-Borg platform. It excelled because it was an exceptionally effective warship. In many ways, Starfleet accidentally built the exact ship that was needed for the Dominion War, years before the conflict even began. The Defiant project may have started as a response to Wolf 359, but its true legacy would be forged elsewhere. As the Dominion War intensified, the Defiant participated in some of the conflict's most important operations. One of the most significant was the First Battle of Chintoka. The Dominion had transformed the star system into a heavily fortified stronghold, protected by powerful weapons platforms and defensive installations. Capturing this system would require a major offensive involving Federation, Klingon and Romulan forces. Once again, the Defiant found itself on the front lines. The battle was brutal. Dominion defences inflicted heavy casualties. Starships were destroyed across the Allied fleet. But ultimately, the fleet prevailed. The victory opened new opportunities for the Alpha Quadrant Alliance and demonstrated the growing effectiveness of coordinated fleet operations. The Defiant emerged from the battle battered but victorious. A pattern was becoming increasingly familiar. Ironically, the closest the Federation came to permanently losing the Defiant didn't happen against the Borg. It happened during the Dominion War. At the Second Battle of Shintoka, Dominion forces deployed the Breen energy dampening weapon. The effects of this weapon were catastrophic. Starfleet vessels suddenly found themselves powerless. But it didn't just affect Starfleet vessels, both Klingon and Romulan were also affected. Starships began drifting helplessly through space as Breen and Dominion forces opened fire. Among the casualties was the Defiant. The vessel was destroyed during the battle. Not crippled, not heavily damaged, outright destroyed. For a brief period, it appeared the legendary warship had finally met its end. Yet even here, the story wasn't over. Starfleet eventually commissioned the Defiant class USS Sao Paulo, a new vessel that was quickly renamed the USS Defiant and assigned to Deep Space Nine under Captain Sisko. The legacy of the starship continued. The original ship may have been lost, but the class endured. Of course, we do know of other Defiant starships, including the Valiant and a few others. By the final stages of the Dominion War, the Defiant class had become one of Starfleet's most respected military assets. The ship participated in countless engagements, escorting convoys, leading wartime assaults, protecting strategic installations like Deep Space Nine. But it also fought on the front lines throughout the Dominion War. When the war finally ended with the Battle of Cardassia, the Defiant was there, standing alongside the Federation alliance during one of the most important victories in galactic history. And that's what makes the story so fascinating. The Defiant never became famous because it defeated the Borg. It became famous because it helped save the Alpha Quadrant. The vessel that struggled to fulfill its original purpose ultimately found a far greater one, and in doing so, transformed from an experimental anti-Borg prototype into one of the most legendary warships Starfleet ever built. Now, it is somewhat ironic that the Defiant's closest brush of destruction didn't happen within the Star Trek universe. It actually happened behind the scenes. During the production of Star Trek First Contact, one of the earliest versions of the screenplay reportedly ended with the Defiant being completely destroyed during the Battle of Sector 001. The idea was simple. If the Borg could wipe out Starfleet's purpose-built anti-Borg warship, it would immediately establish just how terrifying the collective still was. From a purely cinematic perspective, this made sense. The Defiant had fulfilled its role in the battle. The Enterprise E would become the hero of the story, and audience would be reminded that even Starfleet's newest warship wasn't enough to stop a Borg cube. There was just one problem. The producers of Deep Space Nine weren't particularly thrilled with this idea. Executive producer and later showrunner, Ira Steven Behr, reportedly reacted very strongly when he learned the film intended to destroy one of his series' most important assets. According to Ronald D. Moore, who co-wrote Star Trek First Contact, Behr essentially stormed into the offices, arguing the film was destroying a ship that belonged to another production, one whose characters weren't even central to the story being told. Moore later joked that Behr's reaction amounted to, "You can't blow up my ship," and honestly, it's kinda hard to blame him. By 1996, the Defiant had become far more than just another Starfleet vessel. It became part of Deep Space Nine's identity. The station itself didn't travel from system to system, like the Enterprise or even Voyager. The Defiant gave the series mobility. It allowed Sisko and his crew to venture into the Gamma Quadrant, confront the Dominion, and participate directly in the growing conflicts shaping the Alpha Quadrant. Removing the Defiant would have fundamentally changed the series. Ultimately, the decision was made to spare the Defiant. Rather than being destroyed, the ship would be left adrift, crippled, but heavily damaged, but importantly, salvageable. The Enterprise E rescued Worf and his crew before delivering the final blow against the Borg cube, allowing the Defiant to live on and return to service. There is a specific line where Picard does say it's adrift and salvageable, it's this one.
Adrift but salvageable. Tough little ship.
Now looking back, that decision may have been one of the most important production choices made during the Berman era of Star Trek. Had the Defiant been destroyed in first contact, audiences would have lost some of the ship's greatest moments. There would have been no Operation Return, no Battle of Chintoka, no climactic campaign against the Dominion. Ironically, the ship that nearly died fighting the Borg would go on to earn its greatest victories, fighting an entirely different enemy, as we've just explained. And perhaps the biggest twist in the Defiant story, Starfleet built it to defeat the Borg, but history had other plans. So, did the USS Defiant fail its original mission? Well, yes, and no. If Starfleet's goal was to create a starship capable of single-handedly defeating the Borg, then the Defiant truly never achieved its designer's vision. But when the Borg returned to Earth during a battle of Sector 001, the Federation's purpose-built anti-Borg warship was left crippled, adrift, and moments away from destruction. But perhaps that expectation was never realistic in the first place. The Borg were never an enemy that could be defeated by a single ship, not even a vessel as powerful as the Defiant. Instead, the Defiant proved something equally important. Starfleet could adapt, it could learn from its failures, rethink its designs, and create a starship capable of standing against the galaxy's most dangerous threats. Ironically, the Defiant's greatest victories wouldn't come against the Borg at all. They would come during the Dominion War, where the starship earned its reputation as one of the most effective and respected warships ever to serve in Starfleet. In the end, the Defiant didn't become the Federation's ultimate Borg killer, it became something far more legendary, a symbol of Starfleet at war. But of course, what do you think? Did you think the Defiant failed its original mission it was built for, or did it simply evolve into the ship Starfleet truly needed? Let us know your thoughts down below in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive and a sort of theory crafting, be sure to leave us a like, hit that subscribe button for more Star Trek lore, history and ship breakdowns, and you can also check out our Patreon if you'd like to keep supporting the channel and keep videos like this coming to your YouTube feed. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.